So, hi again, everyone. Um, Welcome to another episode of the Lunch and Learn with Microverse. My name is Maru. I'm a student of Microverse from Guatemala. I'll be co-hosting this webinar with Kingsley from Nigeria. And say hi, Kingsley.
Hi everyone.
Okay, shout out to all the people of this webinar today. Thank you for joining early and let us know your coding preferences. Please forgive me if I mispronounce your names. Okay, hi, Owen. He is a full stack developer. Yay. Wita from Cameroon. He likes to problem solving, loves to problem solving. So I guess backend will be his suit. Hi, Maria Reyes Majo. Daniel says both. Okay, Paul from Uganda says both. Kingsley says, you love front end, Kingsley. Miguel from Guatemala, I know him. He says everything he can get his hands on. Mauricio from Colombia says hello. I guess both. Lucas, both. Roman, both. Owen Sam from Kenya, hi. Alexa says both. And yeah, that's great. That's great. So, okay. Well, now some instructions for all of you guys. As you know, Kingsley will give a short background of Microverse, and then I will introduce our awesome speaker today. And our speaker will then proceed to enlighten us with all his knowledge and experience. And after the presentation, Kingsley will take about 10 to 15 minutes to go through all your questions. So please put them all in the Q&A section. The chat will give you the option, so you don't have to switch tabs. But please go to the Q&A anyways to vote for the questions you're more interested in. And then we will close. So, okay, over to you, Kingsley.
Oh, thanks, Mario. Hi everyone again, and thanks for joining. All right, and good to have you here. If you're joining us for the very first time, I know you'll be wondering as what Microverse is all about. Okay, I'm glad you asked. Microverse is a remote software development school where you learn how to build softwares and web applications. Okay, and it's not just like building, but to be the best you can in the industry. So Microverse has the platform and the system that will help you achieve that. Okay, so we study through the process we call pair programming. And the pair programming is a system of learning whereby you'll be paired with a coding partner, and you both be learning together and doing projects together and being the best you can on your learning journey. Okay, and whenever you are stopped, you don't have to be afraid because there are community of students everywhere in the Microverse community that will help you out at every point in time. Okay, and we study from Monday till Friday, 8 a.m. in the morning to 5 p.m. in the evening. And I think this very time, depends on the region where you are and where you are connecting from. All right, and it's actually a full-time program, so you have to give in your best in order to be able to get the best you can in the whole thing. All right, and we have courses that will have placed in stock that will get you equipped so that you'll be able to be the best you can in the software industry. So we have courses like HTML and CSS that will get you started. Of course, Bootstrap is included in it to get you started in the development industry. And then we have Ruby. Ruby is an object-oriented program that will kind of give you a taste of what it means to, do your programming thing. And then we have SQL, that's the database. And then Ruby on Rails, it's a powerful framework anyway that will help you to build wonderful web applications. And then JavaScript and React, I love this. Okay, it will help you to like be able to get yourself more equipped more in your learning journey. Okay, then finally we have our algorithm and data structure that will help you to be able to like get yourself ready for your dream job during your interview. I think that's what you get during the time of your career preparation time. All right. So and we organize a couple of lunch and learn like this every week. Some couple of weeks in order to like be able to get our students well equipped. And during that process, we invite wonderful speakers like Derek, as we have him here, to come and speak to our students. And they come share their experience and the challenges they had on their way to the top in their career, so that our students will as well be able to learn from their experience and then build upon theirs as well. Okay, so one of the reasons why we do all this is to be able to inspire our students and get them ready, and they give them a bit of what it looks to have real experience in the real world in the tech industry. Okay, and then we as well open it to the general public, so that that way we'll be able to inspire them as well. All right. So there are tons and tons of information you can get about Microverse. I will encourage you to go check things out in their website, www.microverse.org, in order to be able to learn more about this very wonderful remote software development institute. Okay. All right. I think that's all for now. Over to you, Maru.
Very much, Kingsley, for all the introduction to Microverse. So now to the main reason we are all here. So I hope you're ready. Today we have the amazing Derek Mei. He currently leads design at AAA Media in Boston, and he's also a part-time graduate student pursuing his master's in human factors in information design at Bentley University. In his spare time, he runs an agency called Untitled Design. I don't know if I pronounce it right, which specializes in user experience consulting, grounded in the disciplines of psychology and human factors. He is also extremely passionate about bridging the gap between design bootcamps and helping designers land their first UX UI job through his side project, The Handoff. So hi, Derek. Thanks for taking the time to do this lunch and learn with us. It means a lot to us. So I'll turn the webinar over to you in just 1 second. But I'm sure viewers will have many questions. Can I just take this moment to remind all of you to post the questions in the Q&A section instead of the general chat? And please keep it relevant to the topic, and we'll try to answer as many as we can after the tag. So Derek, the floor is all yours.
Awesome. So Kingsley, Maria, thank you for that introduction. So I actually met Kingsley and heard about Microverse the first time when he reached out to me on LinkedIn. So I dropped my LinkedIn as well as my YouTube channel in the chat below. And of course, if you guys have any questions, feel free to throw it in the Q&A. We're really just going to have an informal conversation today. Really, I'm going to try to keep it casual and try to teach you as much as you need to know around working with designers as a software developer. So regardless of whether or not you guys are a full stack developer, if you're a front end developer, or if you plan on going more into the back end, there's going to be a very high chance that you're going to be working with some type of designer moving forward. And the more you know about working with designers, the stronger you'll be as a developer. So I think it's very, very great what Microverse is doing, trying to knowledge a developer. So I think it's great what everyone's doing and trying to disseminate and share this knowledge across the world to help designers and developers build more digital products for the web. So with that, I do have a few slides I want to go through everything. This is just going to be a few talking points here and there. But from a high level, what I'm going to be talking about today is really sharing some value around how you as a full stack developer, as a front end developer, or as a back end developer, what you need to know about working with designers, the different types of designers out there, and really give you a starting point that you can learn a little more about working closely with designers. So with that, let's jump into a quick introduction about what we're going to cover. So I'm going to start with a quick about me, just to give you a little background of where I'm coming from. For me, I was actually a developer in the past as well. So I worked primarily on the front end, but I did a lot of back end work as well. And then over the past few years, I've transitioned more into design. So I'll talk a little bit about that transition. And then thirdly, I'm going to cover the different types of designers that you might work with in the future. and then some of the tools that you should familiarize yourself with, but also just a few bits and pieces of advice that will help you in your journey as you start learning more languages, as you work with more stakeholders and different people in the tech realm. And then with that, I'm going to wrap it up with some final thoughts on how you can make yourself become a stronger developer, especially as you start exiting the Microverse program and join the real world and start applying for jobs there. And really, of course, if you guys have any questions after the fact that you don't get a chance to ask in the Q&A, of course, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm going to be creating more YouTube videos on my channel as well that will run you through the intersection between development and design. So with that, let's get into a quick about me. So in the about me section here, I'm a UX lead at 3Play Media. So I'm located here in the United States in Boston on the East Coast. And I lead the design team at 3Play Media. So that involves working very closely with business people, so product managers, but also very closely with developers as well. So a lot of my job is really coming up with designs and then having these meetings to work closely with both front end as well as back end developers. So a lot of what I do is around designing digital experiences. So that can be anything from a mobile application on your phones to anything that you use on some type of website or some type of web application. And a lot of what I do also incorporates talking to people who use the programs that we design. So those are what we call our users. But at the same time, doing a lot of secondary research as well, going online and seeing what other competitors are doing, what other people in the industry are doing, some of the trends that are happening in the industry. And the company itself focuses a lot on accessibility. So what does accessibility really mean? And I would say accessibility is really important because accessibility really means designing experiences that are accessible and active, and anyone of any type of person or any type of background can really use that experience. So for example, if you're blind or you're low vision or if you're deaf, those are the most common use cases for people who are using digital products. So even people who are blind or low vision can use websites because there are different tools on your keyboard that allow people to interact with a website or interact with their computers. Sometimes you'll be able to read captions on a screen if you're deaf so that you can still watch movies and watch TV on YouTube. These are all things that you should consider as part of building any type of website or any type of application. So even as a developer, these are things that you'll learn about, especially when it gets to HTML, really building accessible experiences and learning about WCAG, WCAG, some of those rules online. W3 Schools is a really good resource. I'm sure a lot of you guys actually have heard about it, but there's a lot of rules of thumb online that you can learn about to really make your products a little more accessible. So it's really important to really think about that as you develop applications and work with designers and other developers. And then a fun fact, I'm just going to quickly to talk about this. I love playing basketball. If you guys like playing basketball, feel free to shoot me a LinkedIn request and we can talk more about that as well as any other questions you have. So that's a really quick introduction. Aside from that, I'm also pursuing my master's in human factors. So that's a UX master's program. I actually came into the industry with a computer science background. So a lot of my background really stems from development. So with that, let's jump into this next part of around why I decided to transition from development to design. So I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with the screen on the left. This is probably what you stare at 20 hours a day. Really just looking at code and really learning about all these different languages, HTML, CSS, Ruby on Rails, React. There's so many different frameworks and languages out there, JavaScript, that it's important to get a really good grounding in all of these languages. And ultimately, when you learn one language, a lot of that syntax and some of the principles around software development do transfer over to other types of frameworks and other languages that you're developing for. But I would say my transition from development into design, and this is really just a simplified photo, what you see here on the right, it's really, for me, I was definitely more focused on the front end. But with that being said, I still did a lot of back end. And I know that as a back end developer, I know that in the chat here, a lot of you guys are coming in with interest in backend, you'll still be working pretty closely with designers, because whatever a designer designs for you for the application, you're going to have to consider around how you're going to store that data in the database, or how the data is going to get passed from some type of backend storage system and into the front end. So there's going to be that handoff between all these developers and designers. So these are all things that you should really consider as you're building any type of digital application. So for me, I started working in software engineering for around 3 or 4 years. And then I realized that I didn't want to stay in development for the rest of my life. I wanted to learn more skills. I wanted to broaden my knowledge around product development and product design. So as a result, I transitioned into design by meeting some designers at my existing company that I was working for at the time. So I had worked in the software industry doing some website design for a while, doing some web development. So I was pretty well versed in WordPress and HTML, CSS. I also knew some PHP, was pretty well versed in JavaScript. I had worked in Angular and React. So a lot of these things that you guys probably hear about, and some of these things that you're learning in your program right now. And then over the past few years, I've essentially transitioned more into design. So instead of building what the designers gave me, I was now in charge of actually designing some of those screens and some of the experiences that we were in charge of building. And in addition to that, it was really talking about and learning about the research side of things, because on the surface, there's a lot that you see that might look pretty for a website, or things that you find very easy to use. So if you're on Facebook, or if you're on Amazon, or some of these big websites that you hit every single day, Google, for example, there's a lot of research that goes into building these digital applications. So it's easy for you to use, but also the collaboration between design and development, making sure that the pages load very quickly. You're exactly able to find where you can save your playlist, or where certain videos are, being able to design a search experience that really speaks to what you want to look for. So with that, my transition into development, into design, was very, very natural. And a lot of what I do today as a designer, I still rely on my knowledge of development. So with that, I do want to kind of talk very broadly about the types of designers out there, and then talk about my focus in design. So this is something that I would say applies to most people. You as a developer are a designer. So let me repeat that again. You as a developer are a designer. You might not be designing maybe the front end, you might not be designing what it looks like, but ultimately you're designing how the code is going to be architected. You're making sure that the code is clean, it's understandable, and that if other people are working in addition to you, if you're using some type of repository system or controls, code control system such as GitHub, you're in charge of designing what that handoff process looks like and how other developers are going to work with you. So as a developer and as a designer yourself, you're in charge of a very specific part of the process. What you see on the screen here is essentially all of the different types of designers that are out there. So there's people who design architecture, so buildings, for example. There are people who design lighting sets for theater or for movies. There are people who design courses for some type of online course program, or for even the Microverse courses that you guys are taking right now. There's someone in the back end thinking about what types of courses you should take, and how those courses should be laid out, and how to structure them so that you get the most out of that program. With that said, I want to talk about what type of design I specialize in. So you've probably seen these words online around what UX and UI are, but I do want to take some time to talk about the difference between the two. Because this is going to be a really important part of what you'll be doing as a developer, is working with these two types of designers in particular. So UX stands for user experience, and UI stands for user interface. So to some of you, this might be very obvious, but I'm going to try to break it down into very simple terms. So for user experience, you're really focusing on some of the research and making it easy for users to accomplish what they need. So for example, if you take the use case of Google, which is something that a lot of us use every single day, or any other type of search engine, some of the things that you want your user to do. So your user is really anyone who's coming to the website and performing some type of task or some type of job. And if you're coming to Google, what you want to do is essentially find things more easily. So in any type of search engine, you don't want to have to go through multiple pages to find the exact page you want. If you type something in wrong, You want the system to autocorrect or suggest things that you might have typed correctly instead. So these are all things that you should consider as part of the user experience. It's really, how do I help my user find things easily, and how do I help them accomplish a task efficiently and without frustration? So on the left-hand side here of this slide, you'll see that there's a lot of different components of user experience, and I'll touch upon each one of these very, very briefly. So interaction design is how a user interacts with the page. It's where do they click on, are there any animations that guide a user? Wireframes and prototypes, it's really a focus on how you want to lay out your screen so that's easy for the interface to be found. And how do you communicate this information to a developer so that they know what's built, or what needs to be built. Information architecture, very similar to architecture in real life. So architecture is around buildings and the spaces around us in the physical area. But for information architecture, how do we design online spaces that are easy for people to find what they need? So for a lot of websites, for example, Amazon, there's so many different categories, or eBay, there's so many different categories of what you can buy online, for example. So you have to think about within furniture, how do I break furniture down into maybe coffee tables versus sofas versus other types of furniture. And for complex websites that contain a lot of different types of data, you have to think about how that information is laid out so people can find it easily. And then, of course, these last two, user research and scenario, it's talking to your end user and interviewing them, sending out surveys so that people know exactly how they can find and use your application. On the other side, for example, you have this thing on the right called UI. So UI stands for user interface. And user interface is really focusing on how it looks. So on the left, you're really focusing on ease of use and usability. On the right, you're focusing on making the user interface more attractive and making sure that people enjoy what they're looking at. So for example, a lot of UI overlaps with graphic design, making sure that your text shows up big enough so that people can read it on the screen, making sure that your colors are have enough contrast so that you're able to distinguish between different colors. So for example, you never want to put yellow text on a white background because that makes it very, very hard to read. That's a very simple example, but there's other things that you need to consider as well as part of that conversation. So a lot of men actually, so a lot of people in general, I believe the number is 1 out of every 8 men or 1 out of every 10 men is colorblind in some way. So either they can't see red, they can't see blue, or they can't see green. There's some type of deficiency there. So as a result, if you're designing some type of stop sign, here in the US, we have red, yellow, green. A lot of people are red, green colorblind, which means red and green look very similar to them. And as a result, you need to find some other way to show that within the interface so that even people who are blind or low vision can still distinguish between different parts of your interface. And a lot of, as I said before, UI is very, very similar to graphic design. So you might know people who design graphics for physical banners or billboards or even for magazines. There's a lot of overlap there, and the same principles apply. And then these last items, how do you want to lay out your content on your website, and also your typography? What types of font do you use? How do you make sure that font is legible and readable so that if you're reading an article, you don't want to use some type of cursive or script font, because that's going to make it very hard to read. So that's the difference between UI and UX. These are two buzzwords that you guys will hear a lot. User experience stands for, UX stands for user experience, and then UI stands for user interface. So these are words that you'll probably hear a lot if you work in the industry as a front-end developer. You'll also hear them a lot as a back-end developer too. So it's good to inform yourself of this language so that you're a little more well-versed and can communicate more effectively with people in interviews and with designers as well. So here's a very simple example. So UX really doesn't focus on the visual side of things very much. It's really, if I click this button, where will this bring me to? How do the different screens flow together? What is a user trying to accomplish on this particular page? And how do I make it easy for them to find what they need? So for example, this is a mobile application. There might be a home page. If you click on this little button down here, what does that do? And then from this second page, if I want to branch out into different pages, how do I get there? And then on the right, you have a very pretty design. So this is an example of UI design for a dashboard. You'll see that there's a large emphasis on colors. It's really focusing how you want to present your data more effectively. So instead of like a table, for example, you might want to present it in a chart because it allows you to make more sense of the data from a very high level. So there is a lot of overlap between the UI and the UX design. And there are a lot of titles within the industry now that really focus on that intersection between the two disciplines. So with that said, let's really cover the design process very quickly. I don't know if you guys can actually see the slide. You might have to zoom in or make it full screen or whatever. But what you see here is a typical design process. So as a designer, what I do is really trying to understand the problem first. So for example, taking the use case of Google, if Google wasn't developed yet, or if there's no such thing as Google, if you would really want to conduct some type of research with people who are your user group. So you have to target people who are going to be using Google. And in the case of Google, that's a bad example because everyone uses Google. But if you're taking, for example, like a more niche or very specific application, for example, you have to identify who your person is and then do interviews and do research with them to understand the problem that they're trying to solve. And then from there, after you understand the problem, you understand the people you're designing for, you have to do some research. So you can do research secondary from a secondary perspective. So you can go on Google, you can go on search engines, you can read reports of what other people are doing, but you also have to do primary research, which is actually going out and talking to some of those people that you've identified. And then from there, you have sketch. So that's the first part of your design process where you're actually thinking and brainstorming different ideas for how you want to present the data visually. So if you're building a web application, you would essentially draw up some very preliminary screens, some very basic screens using maybe pen and paper to figure out where a logo is going to be, where a button is going to be, and then from that page, how do you get to other pages in your application? So going back to this page, it's going to be essentially what you're doing here on the left, but using your pen and paper. And then from there, design really focuses on the UI design, but also focusing more on prototyping. So if you're able to click around on something that's not completely developed yet, that's a really good way for you to kind of show what's going on to a developer so that they understand it. But also if you're presenting to any type of audience, as I am right now, it's kind of the same as developing a PowerPoint. You want to make sure that you understand who you're designing the PowerPoint for or your design for, doing the research into whatever you want to put into your PowerPoint, and then sketching, okay, slide 1, I want to talk about this. Slide 2, I want to talk about this. And then, of course, your design process is trying to make it look pretty and making sure that the fonts on here are legible, making sure that you're able to click around in the PowerPoint if there's any type of flow or any type of interactive element. And then, of course, the last two items here are the implement and the evaluate. So your implement is really going in and building it out with developers. So this is where I will touch upon in the next slide. As a designer, as a developer, how do you work together, and how do you make sure that the final product that you're building in HTML, CSS, in these programming languages look and operate very similarly to what a designer is handing off to you? And then, of course, the last piece here is the evaluate. Evaluate after you launch a product as a developer, even if after you build an app, there's so many things that you want to continue doing with it. Maybe there's additional features you want to add. You want to see whether or not people are actually using your application or whatever you're building. And of course, if there's any bugs, you want to go in and fix it. So those are all parts of the evaluation process. But you also want to make sure as a designer, you want to make sure that people can find things easily and people are able to navigate in and out of your application and across different screens without problems. A large part of what makes some businesses very successful in the modern day is being able to design an experience that is very, very simple to use. So there's a reason why people will go to Google, for example, over some of these other search engines. It's because the results are accurate, which is something that they've essentially tailored and learned from people over time. But also the search experience is so simple. You can use it on your app. They've essentially designed Google Home, which is essentially these little voice, these devices that you can speak into and say, hey, Google, can you tell me the weather today? And those are all solutions that Google has come up with to address a broader need. So that's essentially a very high level of the design process. There's a lot of different alternatives here. People have followed different design processes, but from a really, really high level, this is kind of a standard process of what people are following. So from there, I want to follow this up with a quote from Steve Jobs, who was the CEO of Apple. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard about him. Design is not just what it looks like and feels like. It's really how it works. So the first sentence that he's talking about there is take, for example, the case of an iPhone or a MacBook. These are all things that a lot of us are familiar with. And design is not really about how your iPhone looks like or how it feels like. It's really about the operating system and how a user can pick it up. Over time, they've essentially introduced all of these different features that make iPhones and these products so simple to use and so integrated into our lives. So no one ever asked for a interactive phone like that. Before, in the age of flip phones, where you would just enter a number and type it in, no one asked, oh, I want a touch screen. I want to be able to search for things. No one asked for that need. It's really, he came up with that need because he talked to users and he talked to people who had a need and really identified a solution to address that. So design is really about how everything works cohesively in that ecosystem and how an end user or an end person is going to interact with that. So this is a really good quote. It's one of my favorites by Steve Jobs. And then I want to next talk about, as a developer, how you work with designers. And we're definitely coming up towards the end here. And if you guys have any questions, as a reminder, feel free to throw it in the Q&A channel. So here, let's talk about, as a developer, what you need to know about working with designers. So as a designer, these are some of the tools that I use a lot. And these tools allow me to design different screens, some of the screens that you saw earlier, to the point where some of these tools have essentially evolved so much that it allows you to spit out code. So for example, as a developer, you're going to be inspecting CSS and being able to copy some of that over. But also just talking to the designer is really important, understanding what they're trying to communicate with these designs. So all of the designs that they're coming out with, you have to interpret as a developer. So for example, what color am I using? So you guys know about hex codes, you might know about RGB, really knowing the specifics and the details of what a designer is building. And then if you're using any type of framework, for example, if you're using Bootstrap or Foundation or any type of other framework that you're building around, these are all things that you should consider as part of building things with designers. And then, of course, any type of style library or design system that you're building. So for example, if you're going to use the same button on a web application over and over again, it's really important that you make your experience consistent across different platforms. So for example, you don't want your button to be yellow, one shade of yellow here, and then a different shade of yellow, and then a different button will have a different font style. You want everything to be consistent. That way your user or anyone who's visiting your website or application will know that they're on your website and that your brand consistency is very important when it comes to marketing and making sure that all your material is the same. So these are some of the tools. I would say less important is the tools, but more about these next bullet points. So I'm going to cover 6 different things when it comes to advice for developers when you guys work with designers. The number one thing that I think developers should pay more attention to is really the details of what a designer is building. So if a designer is handing off a design to you, it's really important to notice and realize what essentially what you're working on. So all the colors, all of the typography, all of the small details are really important. And I definitely recommend you take the time to sit down with a designer and have a kickoff meeting or a meeting where they can walk you through what they're thinking when it comes to the design. The second part is learning the tools. So coming back to the slide, these are some of the tools that you can experiment with. I wouldn't recommend learning the tool from beginning to end unless you're very curious about design and want to learn more about that a little better. That will definitely make you a very strong developer, because I think what I've seen in the industry is that the most competitive applicants are developers that know a little bit about design. You don't have to know everything about design, but if you're able to communicate with developers and understand their language, that's a really huge benefit of actually working with designers and standing out as a candidate when you start applying jobs. The third piece is really sitting in on the research and learning what designers do. So a huge misconception, and something that a lot of people think, is that designers come in to make things look pretty. That's a huge misconception. There's a lot of work that goes into the research that designers do. So it's really doing a lot of interviews, coming up with surveys, learning about the theory of what you're actually designing is really important, and then how you can solve for that. So if you have the opportunity to talk to any type of designer moving forward, ask them, say, hey, I know you're doing a lot of customer research. I'm on the development team. Is there anything that I can do to sit in and learn more about what you do as a designer? That way you'll learn about your user, who the person who's actually going to be using your application. And as a result, you can empathize with them. That means understanding the pain points that they have, understanding the emotions that they have when they're using your application, and really building an experience that speaks to the core of what you're trying to address instead of just taking a design and converting it to code. There's much more than that. The more you can humanize the experience and the more that you can think about how people are going to be feeling and what they're going to be thinking as you use your application, that's going to make you a very, very strong developer. And of course, as a developer, if you're definitely focused on working with the front end and you want to focus more on working with designers and learning more about that, definitely get very, very good at HTML and CSS and some of the other frameworks, as well as JavaScript as well. So some of the animations that you'll be focusing on the front end, learning about the markup and the styling. If you want to focus on backend, that's perfectly fine, but anticipate working with designers and really understanding some of their language. So definitely, if you're a front-end developer, get very proficient at HTML and CSS. There's always new things coming out when it comes to that realm. Flexbox and CSS Grid, those are all very, very popular items right now that really have made it a lot easier for designers and developers to collaborate and come up with different layouts for the applications you're building. And then the last two items, one is learning to communicate effectively. This is something that I would say is very, very important. There's a really good book I recommend called Articulating Design Decisions. And there's one chapter in there that talks about, as a developer, how can you empathize and really understand what a designer is trying to communicate. And as a developer, I would say there sometimes is a lot of frustration working with designers because essentially you're working on different parts of the process and you focus on different parts of the application or the product development lifecycle. So designers are definitely focused more on the research and focusing on what they can do to make the user have a better experience. But as a developer, sometimes you just see a list of requirements, say, I need you to build this interface, and you kind of skimp out on the details. So for example, one of the best examples I can give is a designer is going to hand over requirements for a dropdown. So for example, if you're on any type of form, it will ask you maybe like, when is your date of birth? And maybe it will have day, month, and then year. You have to think about how that user is going to interact with the form. You don't want them to have to use a slider to indicate which year they were born. You want to make sure that the year, if there's a dropdown, you want to make sure that maybe you're not including years before 1900 because most of those people are probably dead at this point. So it's just like really small details like that you really have to think about as well. So really figuring out how your user is going to use it. There's a lot of different recommendations on the web. There's a lot of common sense when it comes down to, if I'm a user, I don't want to have to click through multiple drop downs. It's really learning how you can communicate more effectively and understand who your user is and what your designer is trying to communicate. And of course, the last piece is being patient. As a developer, you probably have a lot of patience already, especially working with code and fixing bugs. That's probably going to be a huge part of your time. But also when it comes to communication, being patient if a designer doesn't understand the technical language you're using. So the more you can simplify something, the better it is when you're talking to any type of senior stakeholder, whether it be a CEO or a manager, someone who's less technical, but also when you're working with designers as well, just being patient and understanding the pain points that they have when they're building the process. So with that, these are some of the pieces of advice I have for developers. There's maybe other things that you'll realize during the process that come up. But of course, if you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. With that, that's pretty much everything I had to talk about today. I've dropped my LinkedIn and YouTube in the chat box to the right. And I'm going to repeat the name of the book again. So the book that I would recommend is called Articulating Design Decisions. So I'm actually just going to type it in the chat right now. There's a second version of the book coming out right now called by Tom Griever. Yep, so it's Articulating Design Decisions by Tom Griever. There's a second edition. The first edition is also great as well. But feel free to shoot me a LinkedIn request. That's where I'm most active if you have additional questions. And then, of course, check out my YouTube channel as well. It would mean a lot to me if you guys subscribe because I'll be putting out more content that speaks to that intersection between design and development. It's helping designers learn more about the code side of things. So, for example, learning about Agile and Scrum. These are things that you guys will learn about as a developer working in an enterprise or any type of startup, for example. what that workflow is going to look like, but also there's going to be a lot of other topics to cover as well for developers, how you can work with designers more effectively and some of the things that you should consider. So a little more in depth. I know I only had around 25 minutes today, but of course, I really appreciate all of the time you guys gave me today. It's great to see so many people attending this, and I'm sure Microverse has given you guys a lot of things to think about and a lot of great knowledge that you can bring into the workforce after you're done with the program. So definitely recommend it. And of course, Maria, Kingsley, thank you for moderating the session as well. And of course, if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm going into the Q&A right now. So Maria, I don't know if you want to facilitate this section. I can definitely talk a little more about it. So yeah, let me hand it off over to you and see if there's anything you wanted to mention before I address the questions. All right, so it seems like Maria might have some connection issues, or she might be muted. I think I'm just going to jump into the questions. So here, how do you improve your design skills, from Haroon? I hope I'm saying that right. So a lot of what you're doing as a developer is really understanding and getting better at design. So there's the visual design skills of your skill set, and there's also understanding your user. So I talked a lot about understanding your user and putting in on research. So ultimately, when it comes to understanding and getting better at design skills, there's certain principles that you can adhere to. So I'm going to recommend another book here. It's called Refactoring UI. I'm also going to type that in the chat right now. This is a really, really good resource for developers that want to make their interfaces look pretty. And there's a lot of free tips on Twitter. I know the book can be pretty expensive, but I definitely recommend taking a look at some of his recommendations on Twitter, but also going on YouTube and learning some of these basic principles. So, for example, you want to make sure that your typography is legible and big enough. It's really taking a look at your interface as it is right now. You don't want to just display text on the page as if you were kind of throwing up your database on the UI. It's really about taking a look at what other people are doing in the space. So a lot of what design is really, in a way, copying what other people are doing. Not copying it in particular, but also just looking at what other people are doing right. So small details such as shadow and font size and color, these are all things that you can pay attention to. There's also sites like Dribbble and Behance that you guys might have heard about. And those are really good sites for inspiration where you can learn about what other people are doing with interfaces that make them look a lot more attractive. And then, yeah, I would say a lot of it is just a learning process. When I first started as a developer, I was really bad at designing websites and interfaces, and it's probably taken me a few years to get pretty decent at the side of visual design. So it definitely takes time. Definitely check out that book, Refactoring UI. Also, just go on YouTube and take a look at tutorials for some of these tools that I mentioned earlier around Adobe XD and Figma. So let's go to Mauricio's question around what about ready-made pages like WordPress? Is it worth the effort of designing a site if it's available for $30? So that's a really good question. There are a lot of themes out there, but you'll notice that with WordPress, they focus more on website design. So if you want to get into website design, I would say you're definitely more than welcome to, because I think it's a lot of companies and a lot of people still need websites. I think more and more people are looking for a digital presence nowadays. And another thing I forgot to mention during our presentation is, as a developer, one thing you can do to stand out in the job process is to build a very attractive portfolio. So if you're building your portfolio from scratch using HTML and CSS, and you're not using a template, and you say to the recruiter that you built this website from scratch, that gives you a lot more weight than using a WordPress theme that's pre-made, because that shows that you're willing to put in the time and effort into designing your portfolio, but also building out as well. So it shows that you have your design and development skills. So it's super important. When it comes to the themes, there's only a limited amount of things that you can typically do with themes. So for WordPress, there's stuff like Elementor and Divi and WP Bakery that allows you a little more customization. But being able to understand the responsive nature of what you're building and having a little more customization over interactive capabilities. So if there's any type of form, if you're building a web app, you can't build a web app in WordPress. It's really more for static websites. So
sorry.
What was that?
Okay, sorry. I came in. I'm actually supposed to or ask the questions and then we'll give you a response. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem.
In order to save you some some effort. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think you're almost done with that. But let me just take the last one here. Okay. So okay, this one says, can I do a set? I'm really interested in UX UI design. I'm enrolled in the Cal Arts Coursera. Okay. Specialization. Is there any other good resources online that you recommend to learn and acquire more knowledge in this field? Okay.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question. I'll try to address that very quickly. I'll send some links here around a community that I'm a part of on Discord called Design Buddies. So definitely check this one out if you guys are interested. That's a really good place for you to ask questions around UI and UX. There's a lot of Facebook groups as well where you can ask questions. But when it comes to courses, I would say there's a lot of courses on Udemy. If you have access to LinkedIn Learning, there's a lot of great courses in doing UX research and learning about accessibility. These are all things that you need to consider as a developer, and it's great that you're interested specifically in UI and UX. I would say the Coursera class and the specialization is definitely a really good intro. I know a lot of people who have gone through that program with a really good, solid foundation in UI and UX. So I would say continue to do a little more research on Coursera, Udemy. There's a lot of good resources on YouTube as well. One of the ones I really like is by Chris Do. There's a few Instagram accounts, UX Goodies, for example. I would say there's a lot of free UX content online right nowadays, and of course, I also host UI and UX videos on my YouTube channel as well. So you feel free to check that out.
Okay, all right. That was a very, very wonderful resource that you gave out here, and I believe that our listeners will be able to check it out, most especially the guy that asked the question. All right. Okay. So I was about asking when after you were done talking, when you said that developers and designers work together in order to be able to build a very wonderful digital product. Okay. Does that mean? Oh, sorry, I'm asking this. Does that mean that that the designers cannot do it without developers?
I think it depends. So for me, I typically can actually build what I design, and it depends who you're talking to. So I think most designers actually can't build what they design. There are a lot of no-code tools out there nowadays where you don't actually need to know code in order to build any type of digital application. So for example, Webflow is one of them. There's also another one called Bubble. And I've seen more and more the rise of no-code tools, but I think there's a limitation to that. Because if you're building very complex applications, you'll still need code. So it's very valuable for what you guys are learning right now, to learn about building what a designer is going to hand off. It's even more valuable if you're a developer and you know actually how to design, because it shows that you can design something and you can build it as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, yeah, you did. Okay, sorry. Finally, I think this is going on my own part. All right. Designers and developers, like the industry is concerned, which is more needed, a developer or a designer?
Which one is more what? Can you repeat that?
More needed in the tech industry, which is more in demand? Which is more in demand?
I would say developers. Designers, it depends which stage of your career you're at. Okay. If you're a junior designer, what I've seen is that it's very hard to land a job right now as a junior designer, especially during this time and age. I would say a lot of companies expect a few years of work experience, whereas when it comes to development, if you have a solid portfolio and you show that you can do the work and understand the code, it doesn't matter how many years of experience you have. So a lot of it is just around knowledge. And there's also a large demand for developers as well. So most product development teams are structured so that there's one designer for every maybe 1 to maybe even 10 developers. Because designers typically can work at a much faster rate than developers can, because what they're doing is essentially coming up with screens. The bulk of the time and the bulk of the work really comes down to the developer trying to build out an interface. There's so many different moving parts that you have to think about. You have to think about the front end, you have to think about the back end, you have to think about how the data is stored. And writing code just takes so much longer than just moving a few elements on a screen. So I would say when it comes to demand, it really depends. As I said before, the most valuable and the way that you can stand out as a developer is really learning a bit about the design side of things. So it's really about being able to communicate with designers and developers alike, and also just standing out as a developer. It just makes you a little more competitive if you can speak about the design side of things as well. But to answer your question in a very short way, I would say developers are definitely more sought after than designers, for sure.
Okay. All right. That's a very very good one. Thank you for all the questions. Okay.
Yeah.
The answers.
Awesome. Any other questions from the community?
Okay. Oh, sorry. I think that's all the questions we have for now. Okay. And I think over to Maria now.
Awesome.
Okay. 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 I think that's it. That's all the questions we can actually take for now. Big thanks to you for taking out your time to be here out of your busy schedules to join us. You are really amazing. And again, many thanks to you, Derek, for doing this. I really appreciate it, and I know our students as well. Our students as well, they are very glad that you came and people joining us for the very first
and
time.
ask you.
Okay, so before you go, what parting words or final advice do you have for our viewers?
Yeah, I appreciate you. Definitely a little long. I appreciate everyone taking and sticking around. So yeah, definitely send me a LinkedIn request. Send me subscribe to my YouTube channel. But I would say the last piece of advice is just continue learning. The process of being a developer is an ongoing one, especially because throughout your life, things are going to change. 20 years ago, we didn't have such things as React and Angular and Ruby. It's only in recent years when so many things have changed and you're continuing to learn so many different things. So be patient in the process. I would say that's something I would recommend to myself even. I think you'll see a lot of other people who are more senior in their career and you might feel the need to catch up to them. But ultimately, I think everyone moves at a different pace. As long as you're able to do the work and you like what you're doing, continue to stay in development because I think it's a very rewarding career, especially working in technology. I think Microverse has done a great thing being able to help people from across the world learn about full stack development, learning about front end, back end, hosting these lunch and learns. So I would say that's the one piece of advice. So just really enjoy the process of what you're learning and then continue moving forward.
Okay, wow, that's a very wonderful one. Okay, before we say our final goodbye, I want to say this for the interest of our viewers that are joining us for the very first time. I didn't tell you that the good part of Microverse is that Microverse is free until you secure a job. So Microverse has a system and the platform to help you make this happen. So you don't have to worry about anything. Okay. So well, and that's that for that today. Okay, and we want to bring this to the end with all this. We want to bring the Lunch and Learn to the end. Okay, so we hope to see you again in our next Lunch and Learn event. Okay, so thank you guys. Thank you. We really say we appreciate everything. Thank you and thank you and thank you all.
Okay? Thank you, everyone. Great to meet everyone.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. Bye. Happy coding.
All right. All right. Happy coding, everyone. Thank you, Kingsley.
Okay. All right.